Hey everybody, welcome to an online class, the first online class of History 2312, Western Civilization. Originally I was planning on doing this as a live lecture. I intended to do that today, but as if you've read the update I posted, the announcement that I posted today, I got my schedules mixed up, and so I'm recording this in an effort to get it out there to you guys so y'all can watch it on your own time. After this lecture is completed, we will resume doing our regularly scheduled live lectures, which will be on Mondays and Wednesdays for you guys in my Western Civ classes. So if you haven't seen the update that I posted earlier today, please make sure you do that, just so that we're all kind of on the same page. So today we're going to be discussing the modern age. And so this lecture is called Toward a Modern Age. And what I mean by that is we're going to be looking at a number of different things in kind of a long time period, roughly from like the 1860s through 1914 even. It's a pretty lengthy kind of time period, and it covers a lot of different things. We're going to be talking about things like how people, not just Americans, but Europeans, people in Western civilizations are progressing forward in some ways, while at the same time like fighting against traditions and people who might not want to progress forward in those specific ways. We're going to talk about how this idea of modernism, or what is modern, how it affects art and politics and religion. And in some ways, like, we still in the modern age feel the ramifications, the consequences of this kind of drive to become modern. So I think the best place to start talking about modernism is actually to start talking about art. Now, I know that you guys have had me all semester and know that I'm a big fan of art, but I think art is probably the easiest way to explain modernism, because modernism was very much an artistic movement. That's how it started, and the idea of what modern meant. So let's look at modernism and talk about it as an art movement first, and then we can kind of expand more broadly to discuss how the idea of becoming modern affected other aspects of life. So the modernist art movement started in 1860, roughly. Like, that's kind of like a loose year. Modernism began in visual arts, and then is going to spread to things like literature and architecture, music. So what exactly does modernism mean? Previous eras of art and literature and architecture had the titles of their name kind of gave away like what was going on, right? Like, if you think about the Enlightenment, right? Those guys thought that they were enlightened because they were using reason and logic. If you look at the Romantic movement, right? They're arguing for like the passionate soul of humanity, whereas modernism, on the other hand, doesn't really indicate a core value per se, other than just something new. And that's kind of what modern art and the modernist movement was just a break from tradition. Artists are just wanting to create something new, something different, something unique. They're rejecting old traditions in an effort to forge a new path forward. And in some ways this kind of has a disdain of like mainstream culture. And so what you'll see is artists of like one generation of artists will create pieces of art, and then the next generation coming will look at it and be like, no, like, we're going to do something totally different, and they'll change it. Not for any particular reason other than just to change for change itself, like for change's sake, to progress forward as they saw it. Originally, you may be familiar with the pieces up on the screen right now. Of course, these are very famous pieces by the Italian Renaissance kind of artist slash sculptor slash just Renaissance man, Michelangelo. And the top one, of course, is the picture of God and David in the Sistine Chapel that he painted. The bottom one is his Pietà, which is a sculpture of Mary holding Jesus after the crucifixion. Both of these are really good examples of classical art, in that the proportions are correct, right? In the sense that like they are painted realistically. These Renaissance painters obsessed over depicting the human form realistically, right? They wanted things to be accurate. you didn't have photographs back then, so of course portraits were the only way really to have a recollection of what somebody looked like. Now, originally, art during this time period was commissioned by either wealthy patrons who would often get portraits made, or it would be the church, religious organizations would have these pieces made. And so, both of these are examples of art that is made by the church, right? The church commissioned both of these pieces. On the other hand, modern art, as it is going to come to be known, is evocative, right? It is. This is a good example of modern art, I think. It's evocative. The whole point of modern art was trying to represent some sort of like inner truth. And the thing is, like, that can depend on who you are, right? Modern art is one of those things that it differs depending on who is looking at it as to what they're going to experience when they look at that piece. These modern artists are trying to paint kind of like a subjective experience, right? They want you to experience something when you're looking at this piece, not just be like, wow, that's an accurate, anatomical form kind of thing. So let me give you some examples of modern art and what it looked like, and why and how these guys are arguing against the people that came before them. So we already looked at Michelangelo and how anatomically correct his pieces were, and how perfectly painted they were these rich color schemes and stuff. So this is a piece called Olympia by Edward Manet, right? Edward Manet, he painted this in 1863. So this is kind of this is like the first wave of this modernist movement. This painting was incredibly controversial, and it was originally shown in Paris, which was like the epicenter of modern art and really the art world in general. Now, the reason why it's controversial is not because Olympia, the figure that you see painted and laying on the bed, is nude. That's not the reason why it was controversial. Nude figures were all over art, going all the way back hundreds of years. The reason why this piece is so controversial is because of the symbolism surrounding her. There are various symbols in this picture indicating that Olympia in this picture was probably a prostitute. For example, this orchid in her hair, which is this flower right here, this like kind of choker necklace that she's wearing, this bracelet, even this black cat over here, these are all symbols from the time period indicating that she was indicating wealth and sensuality. The black cat in particular was a symbol of prostitution back in 19th century Paris. Even the name Olympia was associated with Paris prostitutes. Additionally, another reason why this is controversial is because, in a way, this painting is a rejection of patriarchy. Olympia is covering herself up, indicating that she's very much in control of her own body. It's not just for morality's sake, right? It's very much a closed-off look, and she's intensely staring at you, the viewer, right? Almost like judgmentally staring at you. So if you compare this to, do I have the picture in here? I do not. But there's other pictures of indicating that this one is similar to, particularly if you go back to like Michelangelo here. Like, you can see how smoothly painted this is. It's like all the paint in the Michelangelo piece right here has been smoothed out. Like, all the lines are very clear. Where compared to Manet's piece, it's a bit more sketchy, right? Like the brushstrokes are short and sketchy, is a little blurrier, almost. And so Manet, this is kind of the first example, or it's a good example of the first move away from like classic art in a way. It's not quite as perfect looking. There's no hard lines, or like the hard lines are kind of like sketched. It has kind of like a feel or an effect. So this is a good example of early modernism, right? It's less accurate. It's not quite as realistic looking as some of the early classical pieces. We're going to see more of this, of artists blurring the lines to try to create an effect. In fact, this type of idea of blurring the lines to create an effect is what leads to the Impressionist movement, which is probably best exemplified by Claude Monet. I'm sure some of you have seen paintings like this. The water lilies are Claude Monet's most famous pieces. He painted over 250 of them throughout the course of his life, over the course of like a 20, 30-year period. And the Impressionists were much less, they cared far less about accurately depicting something. Like, you can see that this is not drawn like a picture, right? It's not like an exact representation of these water lilies, but it's more trying to harness the feeling of it, the feeling of looking at something, right? Of how, maybe how it feels in your memory. So in this picture, there's very few hard lines. There's no still life in this, even though this could be a still life image. It has the feeling of movement almost. It's like alive, like it's shimmering. And so this is a good example of how, you had Manet paint Olympia, and then the next generation of artists is like, well, we're going to do something different. We're going to push that envelope even further to create something modern. Another good example of this, even pushing the envelope even further, is, of course, Vincent van Gogh. Starry Night, probably one of the most, if not the most famous paintings in the world, aside from like the Mona Lisa. Vincent van Gogh was a post-impressionist painter, so he's even beyond like the impressionism of Monet. Again, the idea is that the post-impressionists were like reacting against the impressionists. They viewed themselves as like a different generation with different ideas. They believed that they were restoring like passion to their pieces, and Vincent van Gogh does this very effectively with these really thick brush strokes and thick paint. He painted this piece while he was living in an insane asylum. Vincent van Gogh had a very difficult life, and ultimately committed suicide, at a pretty young age. And the fact that he painted this in an insane asylum, I think, is exemplified, or at least illustrated, by the swirling kind of like texture of the night sky, right? Like, this is not a person who is always in the right state of mind, but that becomes like this kind of like swirling, very thick paint technique. It becomes a staple of Van Gogh's style, and it's very different from the more smoothed out impressionism of somebody like Monet, right? Monet's impressionism is very smooth, whereas like Van Gogh is very you can definitively see the paint strokes, right? Pushing this even further, you got somebody like Pablo Picasso, right? Pablo Picasso, again, using nude women as an art form here, but very different, very, very different from Olympia by Edouard Manet. Picasso painted this piece, La Demoiselle d'Avignon, in 1907. And Picasso was kind of the originator, or the pioneer of what becomes known as the Cubist movement. You can see that what Cubism does is it takes a three-dimensional object and then flattens it out into 2D by depicting multiple angles of it. That's kind of the best way to describe what Cubism does. You can see how like it takes a 3D image of a person, but then like kind of flattens it out into different directions to create like almost like you're looking at it from multiple vantage points. Now the thing is, a lot of people think that Picasso wasn't a skilled painter, but he really, really was. If you actually look at his early pieces from when he was like learning how to paint and draw, incredibly skilled at doing like still lifes and the normal scenes that you would expect a painter to be able to do. But Cubism was his kind of revolt against convention. It was his way of revolting against or rebelling against the Impressionists, right? This is very, very different from the Van Goghs and the Monets, and particularly from the Manets of earlier. If you're wondering what's going on in this image, these are women working in a brothel, so they're prostitutes. All of them kind of like staring at you again in a judgmental fashion, sort of like in the Manet piece. One of the interesting things is that on the right, you can see these two women over here have very odd looking faces, and that's because they're actually African tribal masks. Picasso was apparently very obsessed with African like tribal masks and the way they looked, and art historians have argued that influenced his art, because he, back then, of course, they viewed African culture as very like primitive culture, and so to him, painting and being influenced by these African masks was a way of recalling like authenticity and passion, and so that's why he inserted them into his pieces. But these, as you can see, these, you go from 1860 to this relatively normal looking scene, if not painted quite as perfectly as a Michelangelo, to this, to this, to this. Very, very different within the span of 50 years, as the generations progress and kind of argue against each other. And for some of the artists, art kind of supplanted religion, and this is where I think you really start to get down to the core of what modernism is all about. So Vasily Kandinsky was an artist, and he wrote, he said that the spirit strengthens itself and develops itself just as the body does, and just as the body can weaken and become worn out, so too can the spirit. The essential and life-generating force within every artist is precisely like the talent of gold described in the gospel story. It is the priceless thing that must not be buried away, and any artist who lets his talents decay without putting them to use is like the lazy servant of the story. Now here's where you get to the real kicker. He says, art is a force that has a goal. It must be made to serve the development and reinforcement of the human soul. Right? So this is moving art from just the old Renaissance way of glorifying God by creating art that depicts religious events. Kandinsky is saying, no, art is the religion, right? And he makes that very explicit in the second quote. He says, an artist must train his soul as much as he trains his eye, and above all, he must have something to say. To master a technique, to gain control over physical form is not the goal of art. Art's only real goal is to adapt form to spiritual meaning. That last couple sentences is really important, right? He's like, mastering techniques and gaining control over being able to paint. He's like, being able to paint is not the purpose. He's like, the whole purpose behind art is spirituality, right? Is to take what's inside and bring it out, essentially, and put it on canvas. And this idea of like bringing spiritualism out of your body and into your art makes sense when you look at his art. So Kandinsky, this is a piece by Kandinsky. It's called Composition 6. He painted this in 1913. He did a whole series of compositions that depicted various things. Now this is abstract art, right? This is abstract art, which is a form of modern art. And I would argue that abstract art is some of the most misunderstood and toughest to analyze art that there is. Because oftentimes when people look at something like this, I've heard people say in art galleries or whatever that like, I can paint that. Like, that's not that hard. Like, it's just a bunch of messy, nonsense. But it's when people say that, what they're doing is they're ignoring this. They're ignoring the theory behind why this artist is doing what they're doing. So for Kandinsky, for example, this painting looks kind of just like a bunch of weird stuff. There's some blurred lines, others are sharper, there's like very little sense of depth. There's very few references to like the natural world, like there's no people or animals or something like that. So what is it? So this painting is a depiction of Noah's flood, the biblical story of Noah's flood. Now note that there are very few things that would make you actually think like, oh yeah, this is clearly Noah's flood. Like there's no big boat, there's no animals really. Like you might be able to discern some animals in there. Maybe this like thing right here might be a boat or something. But to him, that's not the point. The point isn't to be able to Kandinsky, the point of art was to depict the feeling of it. So what Kandinsky said he was doing in this piece was kind of condensing the emotional and psychological and spiritual essence of that flood, all of the emotions of that flood in one painting. So it's kind of a story of destruction and hope and fear all at once. And so, Kandinsky is over here trying to achieve kind of this like spiritual purity in art. So, to kind of summarize like this modern art piece, modernism in my view is defined as like breaking away from tradition. And much of the rest of this lecture is going to talk about how artists, and not just artists, but people, how modernism and how people challenged existing structures. Going all the way up to from the late 19th century all the way up, even through World War I. Political traditions, cultural traditions, religious traditions are all going to be challenged by various groups. And so I think that's the point of modernism is that it's a challenge to the previous way of life, and it's people saying, we're going to do something different, we're going to try something different, and let the chips fall where they may. So keeping that spirit in mind of challenging tradition, I think this is probably a good moment to talk about the New Woman and the rise of the women's rights movement, because the women's rights movement was incredibly important, and it really came to a head right at the same time that the modernist art movement was happening. During the late 19th century, you start to get the rise of the feminist movement. Feminism was a broad movement calling for social, economic, and political equality, essentially calling for women to be treated the same as men in terms of politics, in terms of legal rights. And that's what feminism is today. Often there can be a misunderstanding of feminism as wanting special rights for women, but that's not the case. Like, the original definition of feminism is just calling for women to have the same rights that men do. And the reason why this is important is because in Europe, particularly, women were afforded very few rights. America had the same problem as well across the ocean. Women couldn't vote, so political rights were very much squelched. And there were a number of reasons why women had few rights, or kind of that explain the plight of women during this era. So let's talk about some of that. Why were women struggling in this time period? So part of it is that women were industrialism. We've talked about the Industrial Revolution. It kind of split the male sphere from the female sphere. Before industrialism, if you were a farming family, men and women just worked alongside each other. But with the rise of industry, all of a sudden, men were going off to work. Women were often staying home. Or they might be going to their own jobs, perhaps if it's a working class family. But particularly middle and upper class families, like the women would stay home while the men went to work. So that changed the roles in society. That meant that men were responsible for economics. They were responsible for the political realm. Women were responsible for raising children mostly, and staying home, and kind of taking care of the homestead kind of thing. Women often struggled to get work unless you were a domestic servant or someone who was, from a very poor family who would work for very little. Middle to upper class women just weren't either interested or just couldn't find work that would pay them. And there was a stigma that kind of went with this, right? Like this idea of that women had a secondary role in society. There's this great quote by Louisa Garrett Anderson. That's a picture of her right there. She was a British feminist, and she was also the daughter of, she became very famous because she was the daughter of Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, who was Britain's first ever female physician. And Louisa Garrett Anderson says, to remain single was thought a disgrace, and at 30 an unmarried woman was called an old maid. After their parents died, what could they do and where could they go? If they had a brother, unwanted and permanent guests, they might live in his house. Some had to maintain themselves, and then indeed difficulty arose. The only paid occupation open to a gentlewoman, meaning not a common person, was to become a governess under despised conditions and a miserable salary. None of the professions were open to women. There were no women in government offices. No secretarial work was done by them. Even nursing was disorganized and disreputable until Florence Nightingale recreated it as a profession by founding the Nightingale School of Nursing in 1860. So women who were middle and upper class really couldn't find jobs even if they wanted to work. So there's this feeling of being stifled. And there was also opposition to women, feminine equality, or to women's equality, because of a moral outlook. There was a lot of people who, moral traditionalists, people who are very conservative in their social outlook, believed that women belonged in the home. They believed that women's role as a mother and a homemaker was trumped any sort of political desires, right? That you were more important in the home, and so that's where you needed to be. There were even women who believed this, right? There's a lot of, I think oftentimes people misunderstand that the women's rights movement included all women. There were a significant number of women who believed that, maybe we do belong in the home, and there are other more important things going on in society, abolition of slavery, for example, or suffrage for working class men who didn't have the right to vote either. Hunger or improved education. There was a whole host of issues that were going on in the world, and so women were we can wait. Not everybody believed that, of course. There were others argued that women weren't sophisticated enough, right? The old argument that women just straight up weren't smart enough to be able to vote. So there were scientists in this modern era who were going around like measuring things, and they discovered there were some that argued that men had larger brains and thus had more intellect, and so therefore they should be the ones controlling society. Right? So there's a lot of things kind of like holding women back. But what's fascinating to me about this whole period is that if you go back just a little bit in history, it shows that women were some of the prime movers in history, right? Like, these are both pictures from the French Revolution. Women were some of the key drivers of change in the French Revolution. Women played a key role. On the left, those are the women who are marching to the Bastille, right, to basically take over the Bastille. On the right, you can see Lady Liberty, leading the French revolutionaries in that very famous painting. So women played a key role in the French Revolution. They played a key role in the labor movement. A lot of the textile strikes happened because of women workers going on strike. The revolutions of 1848, women played a role in those. Even nationalism, right? The rise of nationalism, which we'll talk about in a later lecture, as these new nations are being created, like the question arises, like, well, are women going to have rights under these new nations? But very few things changed, even though women played these important roles. And I think that was part of the frustration for women, was that they had proven over and over and over again to be a very critical component of society, in so many ways, revolutionary, on the home front, in so many ways, and yet things weren't changing. And so by 1850, you start to get a real push for women's rights. The first women's suffrage bill in England, for example, was in 1867. It was overwhelmingly defeated, but women are starting to gain the tools to advocate for their own independence, for their own kind of rights. So let's talk about some of the first steps. Like, how does the suffrage movement happen over the course of time? It is a gradual process, right? Women are not going to gain the right to vote all at once. For example, and I don't have a map of it up, but in the United States, the first state to give women the right to vote was Wyoming in 1869, but women don't get the right to vote in America until 1920, right? So there was this weird system in the United States for a while where some states would allow women to vote. Texas, for example, only allowed women to vote in presidential primaries, and that only started in like 1917, right? So there was all these. It was a very different and kind of like divided up system in the United States. In Europe, it was kind of the same. Women gain rights slowly. So, for example, going to college was one of the earliest victories for women. I'm going to give you some dates here. You don't need to know them. But in 1867, Russia and Finland allowed women into their university. The very next year, 1868, so did the United States. And then in 1869, so did Sweden. Right, so that's kind of the first place that women start to gain rights, is in education. But suffrage was the big one. Suffrage was the big goal. That was the ultimate goal of the women's rights movement, was the right to vote. Now, you need to understand two terms to understand the women's suffrage movement. There is a difference between suffragists and suffragettes. So a suffragist was a person who was willing to work peacefully within the system, right? They were willing to go through the regular system of the regular political system, advocating for themselves, trying to win votes, like this kind of thing. That's the suffragists. A suffragette was someone who favored confrontation. They were more radical. They favored aggressive action, sometimes even violence, to achieve their own reforms. So let me give you some examples of these groups kind of in action. So this is the National Society for Women's Suffrage. They were kind of like the first big women's rights society in England. 1867 was when they were founded. They embraced the term feminist, but they also embraced the term suffragist. So they were more like, they tried to advocate for themselves within mainstream channels, meaning that what they did was they kind of copied political strategies. They would try to curry favor with the press. They would create alliances with other organizations. So they were trying to advocate for themselves politically. However, they weren't terribly effective because essentially they could just be ignored in a lot of ways, which is one of the reasons why you're going to get more radical groups coming later. For example, here is the Women's Social and Political Union, a much more radical group that starts in 1903. So by 1903, you've had 40 years or so of the other group, the National Society for Women's Suffrage, trying to gain momentum, and they haven't. And so the Women's Social and Political Union is like, fine, like we'll do it ourselves. And they embrace the term suffragettes, right? So this is a radical group. In fact, their motto I think says everything. Their motto is deeds, not words, right? So they were saying we're gonna take action. It's not just gonna be what we believe, but what we're going to do. And they believed in a confrontational strategy. They protested in front of Parliament. Some of them did commit acts of vandalism. In one particular instance, which was covered in all the media in England, a member of the Women's Social and Political Union actually, like during a horse race, like ran herself out in front of a horse that was owned by the royal family. It hit her and killed her, and that was it. So basically, she committed suicide by like running into a horse race in an effort to draw attention to like women's rights. Emmeline Pankhurst, who you see on the left right here, is the founder of the Women's Social and Political Union. Her daughter on the picture on the right, her daughter is on the right. I believe her name's Jacqueline Pankhurst. I could be wrong. I think it's Jacqueline though. Also helped lead this group. But because this group was so outspoken and so radical, they were often targeted. They were targeted by police, and I'll show you. There's Emmeline Pankhurst on the left being arrested. They were frequently arrested, thrown in jail. While they were in jail, there were repeated assaults, sometimes sexual assaults. One of the most horrifying things they had to endure, according to themselves, was forced feeding. So many of these women, these suffragettes, would get thrown in prison, and in order to try to draw attention to their struggles, they would go on hunger strikes where they would refuse to eat. And an effort, the government didn't want all of them dying in jail because that would have been a bad look. And so if these women went on hunger strikes, they would literally force feed them by forcing a tube down their throat. You can see on the right there that she's got a tube. They're forcing it, down the throat or up the nose and then down the throat, and then pouring like liquid food into their stomach to prevent them from dying, from starving to death. So controversial, right? Controversial. Like, it shows you how much, how dedicated some of these women were to women's suffrage, and also the resistance to women's suffrage. Right? I mean, like this, it's significant that they're arresting these women just for protesting. But it eventually is effective. Women's suffrage in Europe does happen slowly, but it does happen. So if you look at this map, I think this is a really, really fantastic map because there's very few countries that actually gave women the right to vote before World War I. Really, it's just Finland and Norway. Finland and Norway up here. The others are Denmark passed it during the war. Denmark right here. But other than that, all the other European nations do it after World War I, and some of them even like during or after World War II. So you can see during World War I, 1917, World War I, 1918, after World War I, 1919 for Belgium. France doesn't extend women the right to vote until 1944, near the very end of World War II. So in America in 1920, if you were curious, so it took a long time for these things to change, for this, like, the patriarchy to kind of give way and allow women to have the right to vote. So the title of this section is The New Woman, and I think it's worth exploring like what that term means at this point, because the new woman is linked to the modern idea. Modernism was a break from tradition, right? This idea that we're going to go out and we're going to change things. And for women, that meant forging a new sense of individual liberty, For some people that meant jobs. For others that meant voting rights. So there was this movement for just not just suffrage, but for independence, right? For women's independence in society, right? That could mean, the freedom to control her sexual life, the freedom to attend schools, pursue a career, obviously be able to vote. And so when the new woman in America is really going to come around in the 1920s, but you start seeing the vestiges of it, the kind of the beginnings of it earlier than that in Europe, right? Even before World War I, you see the beginnings of this new woman. So let's kind of keep on with this idea of challenging tradition and talk about secularism. Talk about a new secular world. So again, we're in the late 19th century here, and let's talk about what is secularism first. I think you got to define that term before you can even really talk about how it changed everything. So the image on the screen that you can see of the church and the state kind of being separated by like a puzzle piece, I think is a good example of secularism, because if you believe in a secular society, what that means is that you believe that state institutions, meaning like the government, and the church should be separate. This is, of course, what America is founded on. The Constitution is written as a declaration of a division between church and state. That is a secular type of government. So again, secularism is this idea that there should be a separation between the church and the government. Another way to think of this is that in the late 19th century, there was a decline in religious beliefs, in religious values, in the institutions themselves. There was just a general decline in religious practice. That process is called, or phenomenon is called, secularization. What is happening is these, people are basically stopping going to church. And so as a result, we are going to see the rise of secular societies where the church and the government are going to be further apart than in previous eras. This is actually a really, really big change. Because if you think about it, for many years, religion and church being like hand in hand was kind of like the bedrock of culture. Religion itself was a bedrock of human civilization. Throughout the Middle Ages, for example, we talked about Thomas Hobbes a while back, and I know he wasn't Middle Ages, obviously, like kind of pre-Enlightenment, but in the Middle Ages, kings drew their power from the idea that God had bestowed power upon them, right? The divine right of kings. And so governments ruled as kind of like an arm of the Almighty, in a way. From Greece onward, like ancient Greeks, the Romans, the scientists that all existed back then were all religious people, like Aristotle, the famous Greek philosopher, to Newton, the famous physicist. They were all religious in some way. Even Voltaire, who was famously irreligious, wrote of believing in like a divine creator, or at least wrote of one. So how does this happen? How do we go from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of a fusion between church and state to all of a sudden a secular society? Well, there's a few different ways that it happens, and so let's kind of like talk through them. One is industrialization. The effects of industrialism. So industrial capitalism, what is it? We've talked about industrialization already, and we're going to go more into detail about kind of the second industrial revolution and what happens with it the next time we have a lecture. But as you guys know already, industrialism displaced people. People who were living in rural areas are often now living in cities. A lot of them are largely uneducated, illiterate, working class folks. So they're moving to these new places, and a lot of the places they're moving into, these cities, don't really have much of a communal life. Most of the time in the small towns in Europe, the church was the center of the town, right? It was the main place where people went to congregate. It was the place that people met up with each other and had conversations. And so you move to a city, where the church is just one thing that's in the city. It's not the central focus. And so there's not as many churches in the urban setting. And as a result, you remember these people are illiterate, so they can't read, so they can't like read the Bible from home and kind of do their own sort of like private devotions. And they're working long days now in these factories, right? This is a good example of a factory here. These factories are, 6-day weeks, sometimes 10, 12-hour days. So when you combine all of this together with the fact that there's only a few churches available in the cities, all of a sudden people are just going to stop going. It's not that they necessarily lose faith; they just lose the habit, right? They just not going to wake up on Sunday morning because they're exhausted from their long work week. So that's one change, is that industrial capitalism is affecting the way people view church, not necessarily because they don't believe in religion anymore, but just because they're just not going to go to church as often. So that's one thing that's happening. Another is that there is a growing distrust of state churches. Grab a drink here. So most countries had a state-sponsored church. A church that kind of combined the political power of the state plus like the religious leadership. Examples of this are Italy, for example, had the Roman Catholic Church as the state church. England, it was the Anglican Church. In Scotland, they had the Presbyterian Church. Russia had the Eastern Orthodox Church, which you can see right here. This is St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, Russia. Germany was a bit different because they had like all those little kind of principalities, but each of those principalities had their own kind of state religion. But the thing is, if people distrust the government, which did happen, right? Look at the French Revolution, the revolutions of 1848. Over time, people are, growing to distrust their governments. And as a result, if you distrust the government and the church is linked to the government, then you're also going to distrust the church. And so what happens is, as people, grow to want to change their government, they're trying to push for new progressive government, the church is seen as kind of like an archaic institution. It's like a relic of the old regimes that's not offering a way forward for people. So there's this distrust because the church was often linked with government that, well, if we're going to change the government, maybe we should also change the church or just ignore the church in general. Another issue that's happening that leads to secularization is the kind of development of new community centers. Now, what I mean, this is a picture of a bar, an underground one, obviously. Probably some sort of distillery. You can see these big barrels over here on the side, and all these people look pretty drunk. But what I mean by new community centers is that in the rural towns, as I mentioned a second ago, churches were really the main location that people went to congregate. If you wanted to meet up with people in your small town, most of the time you did it at church. In new cities, a church was just one of the things that you could do. And church was really only open on Sundays. Honestly, like during this time period, like the churches start to be open less and less, and as a result, now that they're Sunday only, people are going elsewhere to congregate. So you have this like proto-consumeristic society. Well, there are department stores, there's exhibition halls, there's sports, there's theaters and music halls and restaurants. All these different places that you can go to hang out with other people. So church was only held once a day. You could go to a bar 7 days a week, right? And that's where people would go to hang out with other people. And so the church, the church's importance as a gathering place is going to be diminished as a result, partly of like capitalism, but also partly because there's all these new community centers that are opening because of capitalism in a way. I think I have two more things that are lead to the secularization of European society, and one is modern medicine. Now, there were a lot of new medical advances that happened in the late 19th and early 20th century. To be brief, we saw an increased life expectancy, so people were growing older, right? More people were living longer, and you had a decreased child mortality rate. So more kids were living. So you had more children living, and people were living older, so you're going to have a population increase. And you're like, well, how does this affect secularization? Well, what it means is that fewer people are having to deal with death on an everyday basis. Like, modern medicine decreased the presence of death in everyday life. This is actually a really, really big deal. Because modern medicine meant that if you're a middle class or an upper class person, you might only have to attend a funeral maybe a couple times in your life. You know, maybe like close family members, maybe a really good friend or something. But before this time period, during like the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and even the Enlightenment era, anything before really 1850, death was a constant. It was a constant part of life, and it was just ever present. Let me give you an example. So Queen Anne of England, she ruled in like the early 1700s. Queen Anne of England had 18 pregnancies. 18. She miscarried 13 of those pregnancies. 4 of her children were born, but died before the age of 2. So again, let me recap that. 18 pregnancies, 13 miscarriages. 4 of the children were born but died before the age of 2. Her one sole surviving child died before his 11th birthday. So literally she lost every single one of her 18 kids, either as a miscarriage or dead before the age of 11, right? And only one even lived that long. The other ones died before they were even 2 years old, right? So this shows you that death was just omnipresent. It was always there. Having kids meant inviting it into your life, right? Because the child mortality rate was so high. But, and so back then, in that era, all these untimely deaths, you could have friends, family members, children just like dropping like flies. And this led people to religious meditations, right? To prayer and going to church and trying to grieve, in your religious institutions. And so without that constant presence of death, it became easier to avoid thinking about it. You don't have to think about death all the time if it's not around you, and so it kind of like lessened the need for religion because you're not constantly thinking about other people dying or even yourself dying. So people just kind of didn't go to church as much anymore, or at least think about religion, because death wasn't as much a part of their life. Now, the last thing that I'm going to talk about is a bit of a philosophical idea, and that's the advance of liberalism. Now, we've talked a lot about liberalism already as a kind of political idea that kind of stems from that like middle-class bourgeois desire to be independent of the state, of the government, right? But one of the things that liberalism also did was it promoted the idea of tolerance. And this promotion of the idea of tolerance has kind of an indirect effect on an indirect philosophical effect on secularization. Because if societies are becoming more tolerant, meaning you're going to tolerate different religious views, well, that means you're going to be confronted with things that you might not agree with, or things that challenge your everyday notions. And so what this is going to do is this new emphasis on religious toleration is going to kind of redefine what it means to be a civic-minded person. This, to be clear, there's still a lot of religious discrimination happening in Europe at this time. It's not like all of that just disappeared, but there is this push to try to be a little bit more tolerant of other religious groups. Let me give you an example of Jacob Holyoake, who is a English newspaper editor. I think he does a good job of talking about how religion and secularization work together. And so he says, secularism is not an argument against Christianity. It is one independent of it. It does not question the pretenses of Christianity. It advances others. Secularism does not say there is no light or guidance elsewhere, but maintains that there is light and guidance in secular truth, whose conditions and sanctions exist independently and act forever. Secular knowledge is manifestly that kind of knowledge which is founded in this life, which relates to the conduct of this life, conduces to the welfare of this life, and is capable of being tested by the experience of this life. So he's arguing really that secularism and Christianity are on two different rails. They're not really doing they're not doing the same thing. Which is why you can have a secular society that can also have Christians within it, and like everybody can get along. So secularization happens for a number of different reasons. It happened because the Industrial Revolution displaces people and puts people where churches aren't as prevalent, and reduces the importance of church in their daily lives. You've got the distrust in the church. You've got new community centers like restaurants and bars people can meet up at. They don't need the church as much anymore. You've got modern medicine making people not think about death as much, and you've got religious tolerance. So all these different reasons are examples of why over time people are not moving away from religion, but moving away from the church, looking for a more secular type of society, one where church and state are separated. Other reasons, though, there are other things that are going on that influence the move towards secularism. One of them is theories of creation. So the idea of how old is the earth is an old idea, right? I mean, you guys it's as old as the Bible itself, and probably older, right? Just goodness gracious, people have been wondering, why are we here and how long have we been here, probably since people were a thing. But there were people during, starting in like probably the 1500s and maybe even earlier, people started really trying to nail down like how old is the earth, using kind of what their conception of modern science was, like the science they had at the time. There was a reverend in 1648, for example, a guy named James Ussher, who said that the earth was 4,000 years old. 4,000, he specifically said 4,004 years old. Or at least that's what year they were in. And so he said that the earth then, because they were in 4004 BCE, the earth was 5,652 years old. So that was his estimate. Johannes Kepler, who was an astronomer, said that we were in the year 3,992. Isaac Newton said we were roughly in the year 4,000. So the belief that the Earth was roughly about 6,000 years old was pretty widespread. Most people kind of agreed that that makes sense. But modern science, starting in the late 19th century, is really going to challenge these dates of creation. And it's really going to come from geologists. Geologists are going to go around and kind of study rock formations and what they figure out is, this Earth might have been here a lot longer than we think. They start looking at the rock strata, at this layering, and you can see this picture right here is from Zion National Park, from a peak called Angel's Landing, and you can see that this rock layering right here, it shows like ages of the Earth, and in fact this diagram right here is from Zion National Park, which is where this picture is taken, showing you the various elements of that rock formation. And so over time, these geologists are discovering like, oh man, this Earth is actually far, far older than we think it is, because we can see the layers over time. And so what they start to theorize is that the Earth wasn't created all at once, but that it was created over a long, long period of time, right? That there was that geological change wasn't something that happened in the blink of an eye, but more so something that accumulated very slowly over a number of very slow changes. They were also arguing these changes are happening today, that we are living in geological change. We just can't see it because it happens over such a long period of time. Now, for us in the modern day, that seems like just basic science, but back then that was incredibly radical. Because not only were they saying that the Earth was older than 6,000 years old, which many of the previous people who had made those calculations were basing it on the Bible, but they were also saying that we were living through geological change. And if we're living through geological change, that means that the Earth is changing without God's input, in theory. And so that's kind of a challenge to the religious structure of European society, that we're living through this time period where the Earth is changing, but according to the Bible, like, God made the Earth and like that was how He wanted it. And so if the Earth is changing and we're living through that, it kind of adds a question to that. Well, like, is that true then? Perhaps the most famous challenger of the acceptable theories of how we got here is, of course, Charles Darwin. Darwin's effect is so immense that he gets his own little bullet point here. He was so influential during this era. So Charles Darwin was a English biologist and what they called like a naturalist, a guy who would just kind of go and explore. He would go sailing on exploration trips. Like, he took this big exploration trip to South America, and on the way kept this like kind of guide with him, not a guide, a diary, where he would take notes and write about the geology and the biology that he saw while he was there. Eventually, he wrote a bunch of scientific papers. He actually was a very well-respected scientist, even before he wrote The Origin of Species. The most famous book that he wrote, 1859, is this one that you see on your screen, called The Origin of Species. He wrote it in 1859. It took him 15 years to write this book. So this was his like magnum opus. It was definitely his best-known work. Definitely it was like the culmination, the accumulation of all of his work over the course of time. Now, some of the work that he presented in Origin of Species was not his own work. What he did was he took his own ideas and his own voluminous research and then applied it to other people's ideas and kind of came up with this book. And what he argues, essentially, the book's big idea is the theory of evolution. He argued, and you can see this in the subtitle here. The book is called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. So he's talking about natural selection, essentially talking about how biological life forms evolve. And he argued that evolution occurred through what he said was natural selection. Some people have heard this referred to as like survival of the fittest. So let me explain kind of like what this means, according to somebody like Charles Darwin. So he would say that a female salmon, like a fish, a female salmon lays hundreds of eggs at any one point in time. A male salmon fertilizes all of those eggs. Some of the male salmon's sperm doesn't. It doesn't do anything. It just it goes away. But some of the eggs get fertilized, others don't. When those eggs hatch, those new little baby salmons are now competing for resources, right? So you have all these new fish that are competing for resources, and what this means is that any fish that might have a unique ability that could give them an advantage, well, they're the ones who are going to survive and carry on the genetic line. So if a particular salmon could swim faster or was a bit stronger or could perhaps like breathe more efficiently, again, I'm not a scientist, so I'm just kind of giving you an example here. I'm sure this is a lot more complicated than I'm making it. I'm just trying to explain like Darwin's theory here. But so this characteristic, whatever might help a species succeed, will then be passed on to that next generation, right? So if there was a salmon who was born that happened to be a little faster and stronger than his siblings, that salmon is going to survive, and then in theory he could pass those genes down to the next generation. And so you, over time, over long periods of generations and generations and generations, you get new species developing based on those original ones from years and years ago. So Darwin said this. I'm going to read you a quote from him. He said, "As many more individuals of each species are born than can possibly survive, and as consequently there is a frequently recurring struggle for existence, it follows that any being, if it vary however slightly in any manner profitable to itself under the complex and sometimes varying condition of life, will have a better chance of surviving and thus be naturally selected. From the strong principle of its inheritance, any selected variety will tend to propagate its new and modified form." So essentially arguing that that natural selection happens all the time, but change takes place over a long period of time, very similar to the geological arguments being made about the Earth's creation. Now, when Darwin wrote this book, he was talking about animal life and plants and really like nature. It was really only implied that he was talking about humans. He didn't specifically talk about humans in this book. However, in 1871, he wrote another book titled The Descent of Man, where he made that argument explicit and argued that, yes, humans are evolving But many Christians, many people were uncomfortable. Oh, we had a dog invasion. Shadow. Dog invasion. Many Christians were uncomfortable with the idea of Darwin's theory of evolution. So why would this make people uncomfortable? One theory is that it undermined the notion of like a heavenly plan. If God had a plan for you, and how does that square with evolution? If you're evolving all the time, or if you're evolving over time, does that mess with God's plan, or does that, according to the book of Genesis, right? God created man according to His own image. Well, if man evolved over time, then how can that be true? There were people who said, like, this might even dismiss the idea of a creator altogether, because if you're evolving on your own, then who created you, right? Would you really be made by God? And these are tough questions. There was actually a debate between Darwin and this guy, Samuel Wilberforce, who was a bishop at Oxford, where Wilberforce is going to argue very vehemently against Darwin. And he says, Mr. Darwin writes as a Christian, because Charles Darwin was a Christian. He says, Mr. Darwin writes as a Christian, and we doubt not that he is one. We do not for a moment believe him to be one of those who retain in some corner of their hearts a secret unbelief which they dare not vent. And we therefore pray him to consider well the grounds on which we brand his speculations with the charge of such a tendency. Man's derived supremacy over the earth, man's power of articulate speech, man's gift of reason, man's free will and responsibility, man's fall and man's redemption, the incarnation of the eternal Son, the indwelling of the eternal Spirit, all are equally and utterly irreconcilable with the degrading notion of the brute origin of him who was created in the image of God and redeemed by the eternal Son, assuming to himself his nature. So essentially Wilberforce is saying, like, no, we can't square evolution with the Bible, right? It just can't happen. Critics argued, and I think this political cartoon right here does a really good job of showing you what critics thought of the modernists, right? The people who believed in secularism and in Darwin's theories. And you see it at the top of this political cartoon right here. You start off at Christianity, and then you're descending. All of a sudden you're believing the Bible's not infallible, meaning that it's not entire, that it might have errors in it. All of a sudden there's no miracles, or there's no deity, meaning like no God, no resurrection, and finally you get all the way down and you're just a full-blown atheist who denies the existence of a God. So critics argued that there was no reconciling Darwin's theory of evolution with religion, like that it was impossible for the two to exist. But Darwin's theory was important because it was one of many scientific breakthroughs of that era. During this era, you had Planck's quantum theory, you had Marie Curie and her discoveries, you had new theories of relativity coming around, Sigmund Freud and his theories of consciousness. So new science, including Darwin, seemed to debunk thousands of years of thinking. So there's this tension between kind of like religious and traditional thought and this new scientific thought. And that tension is still very much with us, right? Teaching evolution in public school is still considered quite controversial. It can be. And certainly back then, people struggled to kind of reconcile the world that they had inherited from their parents with this new world that they were living in, this new secular world. So let me kind of give some final thoughts here on modernism and this kind of turn away from tradition, because that's what modernism was, right? It was a turn away from the normal. In the case of like social or cultural traditions, you could look at the art movement and say like these artists were pushing the boundaries of acceptable social traditions, right? Not just by in multiple ways, right? By painting things that people had never seen before. In terms of religious traditions, right, you can look at the decline in church attendance. You can look at the diminished importance of religion in certain parts of society, or you can even look at the science that we just talked about that was forcing this whole like new way of thinking. Political traditions, right, that there was new gender norms, right, women speaking out for themselves and advocating for themselves, experiencing new modes of behavior. But the thing is, breaking away from tradition is not easy. There were movements that were anti-modern, people that pushed back against the impulses of the modernists, right? There were people who disdained modern art as like not culturally sophisticated enough. There were people who derided the scientists as as quacks and people who were making things up. During the 1920s in the United States, you see a big explosion of religious fundamentalism as a way of trying to fight back against this the impulses of modern society. Now, the modern era is going to kind of come to a hiatus at World War I, because after World War I, really Europe is going to have to piece itself back together. But modernism is going to remain, although in kind of like a modified form. And in fact, I would argue that like modernism is still very much with us. This idea of constantly trying to progress, constantly trying to challenge the previous generation's kind of inherited behaviors or cultural traditions or anything like that. But there's always the opposite side of the coin, right? The traditions that people fight for are also still with us. So that's where I'm going to end this lecture, you guys. Thank you so much for watching it. And remember, we'll be doing some online stuff. I'll see you guys then.